They were the two faces of the American West, John Wayne and Randolph Scott, both tall, fearless, and carved from the same dust that built Hollywood legends. But behind the cowboy hats and the silver screens, their relationship was anything but brotherly. In fact, Randolph Scott despised John Wayne, utterly and without apology. To the public, they seemed like allies in the same cinematic crusade, heroes cut from the same frontier cloth. But in truth, they stood for two completely different Americas. Wayne was loud, brash, patriotic to the bone, a symbol of power. Scott was quiet, disciplined, and principled, a man who believed that honor mattered more than glory. For decades, he refused to share a stage, a screen, or even a table with the Duke, and when asked why, his answer was as cutting as a gunshot echoing across the desert. To understand Randolph Scott's hatred, you have to understand the man himself. Long before Hollywood fame, Scott was born into privilege in Virginia, the son of a banker, raised in a world where honor, manners, and self-control defined a man. After serving in World War I, he returned home changed, disciplined, loyal, shaped by loss and duty. When he arrived in Hollywood in the 1920s, he wasn't chasing celebrity, he was chasing purpose. Unlike many stars of his era, Scott refused scandal, avoided gossip, and treated acting as a craft, not a carnival. His characters were calm, stoic, quietly moral, the kind of men who didn't need to shout to command respect. Off-screen, he lived the same way. No arrogance, no theatrics, just quiet strength. And that's precisely why John Wayne infuriated him. Wayne's larger-than-life bravado represented everything Scott believed a man shouldn't be. But what truly lit the fire between them wasn't just personality. It was an insult, one that cut deeper than anyone realized, and one that Randolph Scott would never forgive. It happened in the early 1940s, when Randolph Scott and John Wayne found themselves moving in the same Hollywood circles. The studios loved comparing them. Two tall, handsome cowboys cut from the same cloth. But while Scott carried himself with quiet discipline, Wayne dominated every room he entered. At a dinner party hosted by a studio executive, the tension that had simmered for years finally cracked. Wayne, already deep in drink, began boasting about his latest Western and how he, unlike those pretty boys, looked like a real cowboy. His words were aimed squarely at Scott. The table laughed, but Scott didn't. He simply stood, fixed his jacket, and walked out without a word. From that night on, the distance between them turned into disdain. To Scott, Wayne's arrogance wasn't just rudeness, it was dishonor. The man who played America's hero had publicly insulted everything Scott valued: dignity, restraint, and truth. From that point forward, Scott refused any collaboration, declined joint interviews, and quietly let Hollywood know he'd never share a frame with the Duke. Yet behind that icy composure was something deeper than pride, a sense of betrayal. Because soon after, Scott discovered another reason to despise Wayne, one that had nothing to do with Hollywood, and everything to do with war. When World War II erupted, Randolph Scott was already past 40, but age didn't stop him from serving. He had worn the uniform before, during World War I, and now he threw himself into supporting the troops again, funding war bonds, visiting bases, and offering his ranch as a training ground for soldiers. To him, it was a matter of duty. Hollywood, meanwhile, was filled with actors who put their careers on hold to fight: Jimmy Stewart, Henry Fonda, Clark Gable. But one man was noticeably absent: John Wayne. While others went to the front lines, Wayne stayed in California, citing family and health reasons. Instead of battlefields, he chose film sets, churning out patriotic war movies that made him richer and more famous than ever. To the public, he was America's toughest hero. But to Scott, It was hypocrisy. Watching Wayne pose as a soldier on screen while real men bled overseas filled him with quiet fury. He never said a word in public. That wasn't his way. But in private, his contempt hardened into permanence. From then on, he considered Wayne's brand of heroism a lie sold for profit. And when the war ended, and Hollywood crowned Wayne as the face of American courage, Scott decided he'd had enough of illusions, and he'd build his own legacy his way. By the 1950s, Randolph Scott had become something John Wayne could never quite be, a symbol of quiet integrity. While Wayne was busy expanding his empire, producing films that glorified himself, Scott withdrew from the Hollywood spotlight and focused on smaller, moral westerns, stories about aging gunmen, broken promises, and the fading of old values. His performances in 7 Men from Now, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station turned him into the philosopher of the Western genre, a man who carried pain, not pride, behind his eyes. Critics began calling Scott the thinking man's cowboy, and that title only deepened Wayne's resentment. He couldn't understand why this soft-spoken man, who shunned publicity, was suddenly being hailed as the true embodiment of the American frontier. Their paths crossed again at industry events, where Wayne's booming laughter filled the room and Scott's silence cut through it. The tension was palpable. 2 men who once shared the same dream now represented opposite ends of it. And while Wayne's star kept burning brighter, Scott's reputation grew deeper. To Hollywood, it was a rivalry of style, but to Randolph Scott, it was something more, a fight for what it meant to be a real man in a world that had started mistaking noise for strength. And that fight would soon reach its quiet, final chapter. By the time the 1960s arrived, Randolph Scott had done what few in Hollywood ever dared. He walked away at his peak. At 64, he made his final film, Ride the High Country, alongside Joel McCrea, another man of quiet faith and integrity. The movie felt like a farewell, not just to Scott's career, but to an entire era of westerns where honor still meant something. The story of 2 aging gunmen trying to deliver gold through treachery mirrored Scott's own life. A man holding on to his principles while the world around him turned corrupt. Critics hailed it as his finest performance, raw and unpretentious. When the lights went down after the film's premiere, Scott didn't linger. He simply tipped his hat, thanked his friends, and vanished from Hollywood. Meanwhile, John Wayne kept going, louder, bigger, determined to stay relevant in a changing world. He won Oscars, gathered headlines, and cemented his image as America's man. But for all his fame, he could never escape the quiet shadow of Randolph Scott, the man who needed no camera to prove his worth. When Wayne was once asked about Scott's retirement, he just grunted and changed the subject. Perhaps he knew that in walking away. Scott had done something he never could. He'd found peace. Years later, as Wayne's health declined and Hollywood began to forget its old kings, one question lingered in whispers among those who remembered. Did John Wayne ever regret how he treated the man who represented everything he claimed to be? In the end, the story of Randolph Scott and John Wayne is not just a feud between 2 men, it's a reflection of 2 Americas, 2 moral compasses pointing in opposite directions. One defined himself through volume, fame, and image, the other through discipline, restraint, and silence. Wayne was the thunder, bold, commanding, impossible to ignore. Scott was the stillness after it, calm, dignified, and far more lasting. For decades, Hollywood celebrated Wayne as the embodiment of American courage, the man who rode tall, spoke loud, and always won. But behind that icon stood the ghost of Randolph Scott, the man who lived the values Wayne only pretended to play. Scott didn't need to shout about patriotism. He lived it in quiet service and moral clarity. He didn't need applause to prove his worth. He earned it by walking away when his truth no longer fit the noise of the industry. Their rivalry wasn't about jealousy. It was about authenticity. Scott despised Wayne not out of hatred, but out of disappointment. He saw in Wayne everything Hollywood had become: commercial, performative, and hollow beneath the glitter. And in a way, Wayne knew it too. For all his fame, he never reached the peace Scott carried within him. When Randolph Scott died in 1987, the tributes were gentle, subdued, much like the man himself. And when John Wayne's own time came 8 years earlier, Hollywood roared in grand ceremony. Yet, as years passed, it was Scott's quiet integrity that aged better, like a good whiskey, smoother, truer, more honest with time. Today, their names still echo in the dust of old westerns, one the myth, the other the man. And perhaps that's the real ending to their story. Wayne showed America what it wanted to believe about itself, but Scott showed it what it truly was capable of being.